On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Jeff Vier. He is the Senior Director of Production Engineering at Globality. We're going to be talking about the relationship between testing and SRE. Jeff has some definitely interesting insights in terms of how those two worlds potentially should be coming together and why they shouldn't be separated. And I'm excited to have him on to share his views. Jeff, thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Amir. Good to be here.
Awesome, man. I guess two things I always like to start off. One is let us know what Globality does, and then Senior Director of Production Engineering. Just if you could tell us what the responsibilities you have there, would be a great starting point.
Sure. Well, Globality is an AI-driven sourcing platform. So it's designed for businesses to source suppliers of services as well as potentially things, and accelerate that process of bringing the suppliers to the table to have those conversations and sign on with the contract with the company. So whether that's HR, IT, finance services, things like that are all dealt with on the platform. And the AI engine uses these onboarded suppliers that we've done robust onboarding with. It's not, a place where any rando can sign themselves up and claim that they can provide services. Corporations or businesses are fully vetted so that the AI has robust information about them, and then that's trustworthy for the client. That process is compressed from months to hours to get to the point of having in-depth conversation with those suppliers. So our customers really like it so far. On my side, I run production engineering, as you said. There are 4 teams within my purview. 2 of them are kind of the traditional production engineering, which is infrastructure operations and site reliability engineering, or SREs. But to that, we've also piled in test engineering and QA. Test engineering being the folks that do the testing infrastructure, testing frameworks, as well as the kind of dedicated testing tools to do more advanced testing methodologies, performance tests, scale tests, chaos tests, noise tests, exciting things like that. And then the QA team is the traditional QA team who leverage those tools in order to ensure the integrity of the code as it makes its way to production that then the SREs run. And then the infrastructure team kind of is the underpinning of all of that, running the CI/CD pipeline and the security groups within AWS and all that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Sounds like you'll be kept quite busy running 4 different teams. And I guess we're going to talk about how the SRE and testing is actually kind of separated traditionally. And I know you have some views, and maybe at a high level, I know you kind of just went through it. In terms of the 4 teams you're managing right now, can you maybe provide a little bit more depth into how those teams work together and kind of what the current relationship is?
Absolutely, yeah. So roughly they're coupled pretty tightly into 2 pairs. So infrastructure and SRE are very tightly coupled. And to be fair too, the teams are growing pretty aggressively as the company is growing. And when I joined, they had lumped the 2 teams into one DevOps team, which is not the name of the team that I would prefer. DevOps is a culture. It needs to be spread across all teams in my take. And the infrastructure and SRE groups were kind of more overlapping in their Venn diagram, and that is drifting apart as the teams get larger. We have more specialized duties and so forth. So the infrastructure and SRE group works together to ensure the integrity of the platform and the product running on that platform. And then on the other side, we have test and QA. When I joined, it was only QA, and they were dependent on really kind of UI only testing was kind of the main tool that they were using. And in order to facilitate more robust testing, I had one of the engineers from QA spin off as the founding member of the test engineering team, and then have since hired onto and expanded that team. And the test engineering team now is tasked with building up a proper framework to be able to do end-to-end testing. So leveraging that whole test pyramid where you start with unit tests, which are very much the responsibility of the engineers writing the code. Then you have integration, functional, contract testing as the next layer up in the pyramid, which is kind of a handhold between QA test planning and the engineer delivering those plans on a more fundamental test platform. Then on top of that, you have API tests. And then on that, you have UI tests and end-to-end tests and smoke test collections and so forth. So the QA team is right now being sort of refactored by the new director of test and quality, who reports to me and is helping flesh out kind of the goals of what we're trying to accomplish between those teams and how they can better deliver the quality that they want to the SREs to run it. And on top of that, you have the kind of confluence of the infrastructure team working with the test engineering team to ensure that they're using the tools in the way that has been established, that they're putting everything. We use Terraform, for example, for managing our instances. They're using Terraform the way that we're using it and leveraging GitHub in the same way that we've established for the rest of the organization. So there's interplay amongst all of the teams and dependency across those teams as well. There's an infrastructure operations person who is dedicated to the needs of the test engineering team. So there's lots of dotted lines across the org within my production engineering umbrella.
Awesome. And I guess when it comes to the testing team and the relationship with the SRE team, I guess it's evolving. You hired a new director of testing and QA to help you with that. In terms of what you're seeing currently and maybe at previous jobs, what's that traditional relationship look like? And then maybe we can talk about the fact that they are separated most of the time.
For sure. So I think one of the common, I'm going to say pitfall because that sounds really harsh, but kind of a pitfall, is that the QA team tends to be just a speed bump at the end of the development process. QA does what they do. There's often a conflict of interest that QA reports to the same management as the developers, which has the effect of the pressure being to get the code out the door, as opposed to wrapping QA alongside the SRE group, where their first mandate is to protect the health of the production environment. And so I think that's a much more aligned stance than just being kind of a catching major bugs, right? Like the idea is to really push the limits of what can be caught before it hits production. And so in order to get there, some of the more mature engineering organizations in the Silicon Valley certainly have kind of shifted away from this QA, quality assurance, into QE, quality engineering. And differentiating between those two can be somewhat lip service depending on the organization, but there are certainly organizations that take it very, very seriously. And I've been lucky to have been part of some of those. And those teams kind of are a confluence of the two, right? Where they are building their own test tools and leveraging them to do the quality checks that are needed. The direction that I've gone here is because finding those unicorns of folks that are engineers who want to test for quality is a little bit rough to come across, whereas a software developer in test is not impossible to come across, and a high quality engineer, a QA engineer, is not impossible to come across. And marrying the two into paired teams is an easier path to success, in my opinion, and in my experience. The tooling is a dedicated discipline, and the development of that tooling, engineering of that tooling, is its own specialty, and testing is its own specialty. And so instead of trying to find an all-in-one, which is not impossible, I know several that are excellent at it, but they are very, very hard to come by, and they're in very high demand versus a discrete team that is able to specialize in what they specialize in.
I do like how you separated out the specializations. I think a lot of times, smaller companies, smaller startups and whatnot, they are looking for the person that is I like to call them the hybrids, that they overlap in the Venn diagram more than typical. And those are harder. And I guess from your experience, you're trying to hire more specialists to come in and fill, those specific gaps. And I guess when you were talking about the pressure to get the code out the door versus protecting the health of the production environment, I guess when you're now potentially looking at the SRE team and the testing team working closer, that relationship with the SRE team, I guess, what's the workflow? I guess, how does one group, work with the other, especially when, things do come up and obviously they're more aligned like your team they are?
Well, anybody has a kind of a right to call in the test engineers if needed. So whether that's the SREs, which are in our organization, the way it works is we have a tier 1 SRE group, which are the folks that handle incidents and are the ones that respond to monitoring events, respond to escalations from customer success or tech support, which they are not. Customer success and tech support are a dedicated team, and they do the interaction with the customers in order to ensure that everything's working well or answer questions they might have and whatever, all of the things that they do on that team. Whereas the tier 1 SRE group are specifically around incident response and handling the way the escalations work if necessary. Like they are proper SREs. They have administrator or root as necessary to perform the tasks that are needed to be performed to do kind of typical runbook style incident response. However, they have the ability to escalate to either the software developers of the code in question or a higher level SRE in order to take care of the incidents that come up. What we're looking to accomplish with the test flow, the way that code proceeds its way through the pipeline into production, is to, one, be able to accommodate true CD, right? We're certainly not in a situation where I would call our CI/CD pipeline true CI/CD. It's not even true CI, to be honest with you. Like, it is gated at a few places. And so we have release events, basically. So we have release managers who are able to push that stuff to production. Now, I'd like to get us to the point where we have true CD, but in order to have that, we need to have a robust test platform that gives us confidence that we are having any sort of potential issues, whether that's resource overconsumption, whether that's buggy misbehavior, whatever it is that may affect the way that we run the platform, we're aware of it before it makes it into production. At this point, the tier one group is the team that is kind of overseeing those release events that are not incidental. Like, we certainly have incidental releases happening all the time, every day, but they are pushed by these release managers. But if it's a major thing, like it's a new feature or it's a whole new service or whatever it is, then that will be a managed incident by the tier one team that then can drag in the QA engineers, the testers, as well as customer success in order to make sure that it works in the way that they would be walking their customers through the process, that the engineers who are responsible for that code on hand in order to ensure that it is not having a problem that's unexpected, et cetera. So the interdependency there is that the SREs certainly can't be responsible for testing the things themselves. I mean, that's not their job to necessarily know the ins and outs of what the test plan is supposed to be accomplishing, nor is it their space to write the test parts of it. Now, they do take care, of course, to write monitoring checks. They write metrics, polls, or emissions, depending on that scenario. They, set up the dashboards. They do all of the stuff that is in support of the platform itself. However, lumping into another duty of theirs to test that software before it even makes it to production would just be untenable, in my take. I know that there is this tendency to slide towards absolute generalism, like you were mentioning before, finding those hybrid folks that kind of do all. And I think that there are certainly very successful arrangements where it's a smaller development team that has a dedicated QE or QA resource, a dedicated SRE, small team or person. And you're able to take care of all of that because you're so intimately familiar with exactly what that team is producing and running in production. However, we're in a arrangement of a unified SRE group that is in charge of running all 90-ish services. And we're not even to the point of what I would consider true microservices, where everything is very crisp and very discrete. These are large and small services depending on the needs and what it's delivering. And it's been an evolution of that product. We're moving more and more towards a microservices architecture. However, it's a very long process considering we have a running production environment that has existing customers and we can't be drastic in our rewrites and so forth. So having all of that in production and being successful necessitates that intercommunication between those teams. So we and I want the SREs to be able to depend on what comes out of that testing pipeline, not just have it be like a kind of a light check mark and then everyone's still nervous about it when it makes it to production. You want the teams to assume that if it makes it through, we know it's clean, unless it's for some obscure edge case that we haven't yet tested for. And then if we found that thing, we have our procedures. Tier one would handle that, roll it back, deal with, all right, let's get our tests in place, make sure that's covered and roll forward again. It was a very long-winded answer. Hopefully that hit on the points that you're hoping for.
No, it's actually was really insightful. And I think, someone who's listening who, might not have the testing team aligned with, production engineering probably can see some of the benefits of that. And I was actually going to ask you as a follow-up to that was, so obviously based on what you just described, the workflow between testing and the SRE side, are there opportunities for, existing teams to find, components of testing to shift out of development that are maybe more useful as a more of a platform or organizational oriented service?
Well, I think there's a few things that will, I think, make the SREs more confident in the testing results. So, first, having testing or the testing platform, I've often found that the testing platform, first of all, often is not production like. And I think everybody ascribes to like tests should be just like production, of course, because then you get into resource consumption issues, which you can't measure. I mean, you can extrapolate some data, but like if you're running everything on, tinies on AWS, but everything runs on 8XLs, well, that's not obviously that's extreme, but if they don't match, you have to extrapolate data. Having test and production be as similar as you reasonably can get it is important. But the thing that I think gets overlooked, even when you have parity between the test environment or any pre-production and production, is often it's kind of left out in the cold as when it comes to metrics collection, when it comes to tracing tools, when it comes to monitoring. Not to say that monitoring should be plumbed into your response team, like into your SRE flow. However, those tools should be made available to the people who do want to see them. So the testing team, the developers themselves. And that's something that we are doing at Globality, which is the monitoring platform of choice right now is Dynatrace, which covers metrics collection, log aggregation, tracing in order to trace back the flow of the issue that is encountered. Like if we have a 500 error, like because of the nature of a chain of APIs, it's sometimes difficult to track down where did that actually originate from, since the 500 isn't seen until the user interface, but it could be several API layers deep. So tracking all that stuff down, it can be a headache. So having the same tool set applied to the test environment so that it can be observed to the same degree that the production environment can be observed in helps a lot. It's very easy to have things kind of, when you're looking at them visually, like, well, it worked, so it passes enough that it makes it through tests, so there wasn't overt crashes or bugs or whatever. But most monitoring shouldn't necessarily be tied to specific metrics and be threshold based if you're doing advanced monitoring. However, some things just are out of necessity, or even if they're doing some advanced, algorithmic style checks that are looking for anomalous behaviors, there could be changes that at a glance don't seem like terribly anomalous, but the production environment sorely disagrees and it lights up as soon as that code lands. So leveraging those tools in test will foreshorten that. Those things would come up sooner and be able to be cut short before it hits production and be dealt with. One of the kind of mantras that I really enjoy, I don't know if mantra is the right thing, but so a number of years ago, I was working at Yahoo. I was on one of the monetization teams. So they did the sponsored search when you search for something and then it has the highlighted box on the top and side of the results. That team had a robust kind of process for the way code made it to productions. One of the things that was on your checklist for your first 6 weeks as a production engineer was to block a release from production. It was your duty to block releases from production because you're the last line of defense for production and protecting the health of the production environment. Our QE team there, that is QE in the Yahoo terminology, was excellent. Like they were really, really good. I worked with one of the folks from that team in future jobs. I convinced him to come work at a company that I worked with after that. And they caught a lot. Like they were very aggressive in the way that they did their testing methodology to prevent any nastiness from getting through. But it was still the SRE's job to production engineers there. SRE wasn't the term that it was then. It was the production engineer's job to review, kind of the nuance of the graphs and so forth that came through the pre-production performance test set. So resource consumption differences, comparing those against the release notes and so forth. That way, like let's say just this application that was being released consumed 5% more memory overall in a soak test where it had run iteratively for the equivalent of a few days. And that 5% might not be a big deal. However, if it's not explained, okay, it needs to be explained. Like if the engineers are not aware that their code changes are now absorbing more memory and in the limited amount of data that you get from a test, which is good data, but you only have a few days of that data, but it's going to run for potentially months in production, that makes a big difference. So if there is an anomaly with the performance from test to production, you need to know about it. And having that robust tool set around the test environment allows visibility into those differences. So again, this was a different architecture. So it wasn't this microservices. These were heavier monolithic applications that had a more dedicated SRE team, production engineering team, in order to look at its issues and make sure that it was performing as designed. However, leveraging a robust toolset against the testing environment was still the way they were able to have that deeper observation into how it was going to perform in production. And I've absolutely carried that through in subsequent jobs to really emphasize the need for robust tooling against the pre-production environments in order to give the visibility to whoever is looking at it, whether that's a dedicated SRE team, which is not how Globality is structured, but dedicated to a specific application that is. Whether it's the tester, the QA person, the developer themselves, having the tools at hand that they have that depth of insight is necessary. If you're just hoping for the best and then measuring it in production and then trying to roll it back, that's a lot more difficult than catching it before it makes it out there and potentially impacting a customer.
I think that's really interesting, especially given the two distinct environments that you'd come from. Obviously, monolithless is a little bit more standard versus the microservices that you're dealing with now. It sounds like philosophically I know security people talk about that shift left consistently, and that's something that's important to them. And I mean, I think you might have alluded to it before, or it might be a part of your philosophy is of the shift left that's happening with testing potentially. And, what you described as, not having obviously all the testing done under the SRE, that's not what's expected, but at least having the other teams aware of what your responsibilities are and the better partnership and whatnot that you're looking for.
Shift left is a huge part of the push right now at Globality, for sure. As I mentioned, the new director of test and quality is a huge fan of this and making sure that the entire organization knows what the goals of both his teams as well as the business's goals are, which is ensuring stability, ensuring quality, ensuring that the code that is delivered delivers what it was supposed to deliver and as consistently as can be expected. And then from the SRE side, they have a need, and infrastructure operations is dragged into this as well, is around that resource consumption topic, that everything is going to not suddenly blossom into, needing to auto scale at twice the rate that it did. I mean, we have scrutiny around our hosting bills, just like almost everybody does. And not that we are pinching every penny, but we want to make sure that we are getting our money's worth out of what we're hosting. And it all kind of flows together with the tools that are necessary for overt, functional bugs that the customer might encounter where there is a something went wrong error or other, lack of functionality that's not expected, or whether it's an internal problem where machines are thrashing or overscaling or whatever they might be doing, misbehaving, that may not be customer visible, but still is quite a fire drill when it happens within your organization. So pushing left and shifting that exposure of that data as early in the development process certainly just is better for everybody. I mean, if you can catch a bug 5 minutes after you wrote it versus a week after you wrote it, and then trying to figure out where was my head when I wrote this and where is it? And, how do I dig it back out? And now that you've had a pile of commits come behind it, is a much more expensive process, both in your time as well as the potential involvement of all these other teams who are now spun up trying to deal with that bug. So the interplay amongst the teams is extremely valuable and just easier. Once you get to the point where everybody can lean on each other to either provide tooling or provide insight, it becomes an easier process than the kind of traditional over the fence pitch of new code that's then dealt with by a testing team who pitches it over the fence to the next team. And that's kind of the fundamentals of what the DevOps culture is trying to accomplish, right? Like everyone has handshake agreements all around as to who's expecting what from whom. And it makes for a much more smooth, much more congenial process. There's not the process of finger pointing on top of trying to figure out what went wrong as well.
Awesome, man. Definitely love some of the insights. I'm sure we're going to get some people that'll reach out to kind of pick your brain about what you're doing at Globality and kind of how you're progressing with some of that shift left. What's a good platform or what's a good way of contacting you? Is LinkedIn a good place to reach out to you if someone has a question?
LinkedIn certainly works. I can't say that I'm, trawling on LinkedIn all day. I certainly have a busy day, but I'll definitely reply in hopefully not too long of time.
Awesome. Again, thanks for being on the podcast. I definitely appreciate it. And that's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guests, different topic. I always ask for two things. One is if you like the podcast, share it with someone. That's how it's been growing. And thank everyone who does. I appreciate that. And secondly, if there's a topic that you want us to cover, hit me up on LinkedIn. Let me know what that is. I'll do my very best to find someone to be able to talk about it. Until next time, goodbye.